I thought I have a background in paleolimnology. I'm going to talk a bit more about my background, but I thought that the opportunity of using paleolimnology as a big data source is something that needs to be harnessed. And I felt like myself to be the person to do that. So I want to talk to all of you a little bit about that. So just about my background, I have a PhD in paleolimnology. I do aquatic ecology. I have pivoted a bit into biogeochemistry more so in nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon biogeochemistry. And I have a big computational biogeochemistry, computational ecology background as well. And I kind of use all these hats that I wear to answer some of the questions that are plaguing our society and aquatic ecosystems these days. So some of the tools, I'm going to briefly go through them. I do a plethora of tools ranging from field analysis, using different kind of sensors and buoys, and also lake sediment cores. And I do a lot of lab analysis, so nutrient analysis, chlorophyll. I use pigments and optical properties of water, for instance, and also microscopy to analyze diatoms, and which I love, by the way, forever my favorite tool to use, and also sediment geochemistry tools. And combine these with geospatial analysis. So large spatial scale or global scale gridded data sets that can give information about be it climate or land use changes or atmospheric deposition of nutrients, for instance. And then finally, using different kinds of analytical statistical tools ranging from multivariate analysis to Bayesian probability analysis or machine learning and process-based models. So some of the questions that I think everybody here kind of is dealing with are like the challenges that we think of in aquatic systems. We know that global climate change is a big deal, agricultural intensification, urbanization. All this is leading to eutrophication, harmful algal blooms, issues such as hypoxia, fish kills, reduced clarity, and so on. And we are not, this is the new norm, unfortunately. But I wanted to talk a bit more about phosphorus loading because especially being in the Great Lake ecosystems, I realized that decades of work has gone into reducing phosphorus into our aquatic ecosystems. In excess, we know that it leads to eutrophication and harmful blooms and formation of cyanotoxins. And despite years of efforts in controlling or managing these inputs, and the results are kind of not as optimal. So we have gone from banning phosphorus-rich detergents to implementing better wastewater treatment plants, implementing BMPs, but still we see that the results are not that great. And sometimes people have recently found that it could be because of something we call as legacy nutrient or legacy phosphorus. I'll come back to this a bit more. But some of the knowledge gaps that I have been noticing and working with is that when we think about implementation or of any kind of watershed management tool or any kind of lake management tool, we focus mostly on current or recent influence of watershed disturbance. And there's a big gap in addressing or considering long-term or historic disturbance on aquatic ecosystems. And there needs to be a push in trying to consider these systems when we formulate management strategies or BMPs and so on. So going back to what legacy phosphorus is, some of you may have heard it, or legacy nutrients in general. What it means is it's surplus amount of phosphorus or any nutrient that is accumulated in the watershed, in lakes or in streams, for instance, and river bottoms due to historic excess in agricultural activities. So if you have a lot of fertilizers and manures and atmospheric deposition, which is depositing in the soils and in groundwater, for instance, but is not being taken up by the crop, it accumulates over the years and is sitting there as an unused source of phosphorus and nitrogen sometimes. And what happens is that over the past 100, 200 years, human intervention has led to this accumulation of legacy phosphorus or legacy nutrients in these aquatic ecosystem or in the watersheds, and how that's affecting the legacy, the watershed or the lake ecosystems is not really well known. There's been a lot of talk, especially in the modeling world or in the hydrology and engineering world, where we think about how much legacy phosphorus is there in the watersheds, but when it comes to lakes or river bottoms, there is not a conversation. And I'm kind of hoping to lead this front and wanting more people to join me. So we're trying to find out how much accumulation of excess nutrient exists in the watershed and also in aquatic systems, because these can serve as unaccounted for source of nutrients that continue to degrade water quality, even when measures have been put to check or reduce the amount of nutrients that flows into our aquatic systems. To sort of understand how much, first of all, how much phosphorus is available in lakes ecosystem globally, I want to look at a centennial scale accumulation and also the trends and drivers, because I think it can provide useful insights about how the systems have deviated from baseline conditions. And also when you look at things at a global scale, you can identify the hotspots or vulnerable zones that need to be addressed and thought about when we're thinking about big plans as we move forward in the Anthropocene. So I think that harnessing paleolimnological data can be a big and useful tool. I think people kind of know what paleolimnology is, but for the uninitiated, we know that it's a field of science where we reconstruct environmental histories using chronologically constrained lake sediments. And we use a variety of proxies. It could be physical, chemical, biological, even biological proxies to reconstruct past environmental histories. So essentially, lakes act as basins that catch everything what's happening in the watershed, so all the disturbance that's happening in the watershed, as well as what's going on within the lake ecosystems. And you can take sediment cores, date them, and you can get a very nice archive of how the ecosystem has responded to these changes over the years. And I think there's a need to explore the application of these data sets for global, not only global nutrient budgets, but also developing better resource management strategies. So since I did a PhD in Arkansas and worked in this beautiful Mississippi River Delta, I wanted to include some of the results from there, because usually when paleontologists because it's an expensive field of science, it takes a lot of money, lots of effort, lots of manpower, lab hours. We usually restrict ourselves to smaller locations, or one lake or a regional study. And some of the examples I want to give. So first one, that's one of the studies that I did in Lower White River, which is a tributary to the Lower Mississippi Valley. It's a beautiful Ramsar wetland site, has I think like 300 oxbows or something like that, which provides unique history of how the system has evolved. So there's been issues with how hydrological systems have been manipulated, so dams have been made and levee systems have been constructed, as well as wetlands have been removed to make a way for more agriculture, and this has been going on. So I wanted to use lake sediment cores here to see how the system has responded and evolving through times. So looking at some of the trends, obviously we think about temperature and precipitation, and you can see like temperature kind of is increasing through the 1960s till 2010s, as you might imagine. Precipitation is a non-monotonic trend, with the system gets a lot of precipitation in spring and also in fall and winter, and we see huge floods in this area as well. But what struck me most, because this is kind of within the rice belt, Mississippi Delta region, there's so much agriculture in this area. We think that everything, the water quality in these lakes and wetlands are being driven by the amount of crop that we see. But we found, interestingly, that if you look from 1960s onwards, there hasn't been a big shift in how much area is under agriculture. So I guess if you look from like pre-European times, you would definitely see a big shift. But in general, overall, there's like a plateauing of how much area is under agriculture. But what strikes me as most important is that if you, I don't know if you can see my pointer, we see a drastic increase in the amount of fertilizer, and usually phosphorus fertilizer that's being added. And that's linked to a lot of policies and also the type of cropping pattern that you see. So we shifted historically from, say, cotton to now in the 1970s and onwards, we see a lot of soybean and rice, which requires a lot of fertilizers. So there's a distinct shift in what's going on in terms of disturbance in the watersheds. We also see changes in amount of connectivity. This river system has 4 to 5 dams, and we see how hydroclimate, along with the increases in extreme events, we also see the hydro periods is kind of changing because of dams. We see big floods that stay flooded, keep the wetland flooded for a very, very long time. So it's a combination of human intervention and climate, and we see how it affects the lake ecosystems. So basically in short, what we saw that from 1960s onwards, we saw an increase in land clearance around the 1970s, but mostly there was a shift from soybean to rice cultivation. Along with that, the nutrients that were added also skyrocketed. We saw a decrease in connectivity, and what that led to overall was that it was an increase in residence time. So essentially, if you think about this wetland as a big soup of water that stays flooded, and all the sediment and nutrient just sloshes around for a very, very long time, and that leads to, poor changes in lake ecosystems. So we saw historically a lot of pennate diatoms to now centric diatoms, which are indicators of eutrophication. So there's not, as mentioned, there's not a lot of diatoms in the talk, but I thought some of the colleagues would appreciate looking at a few diatom pics. So here it is. So this is a one-off study, but there are several studies that are kind of looking at the effect of human interventions and human activities on lake ecosystems. But as I mentioned, most of these studies are lake-based, single lake-based, or sometimes they could be regional. So that's the study done in Finland. I think they looked at 23 lakes. But there's definitely a need for a more global data set, global perspective, because we can then actually look at patterns and trends and what's changing where at, like a bird eye, get a bird eye view for that, and really identify zones that we need to address and are vulnerable to future changes. So this study, which is kind of a current work at University of Waterloo, we looked at historic watershed disturbance. And by historic, I mean like 100 to 100 years, mostly last 100 years that I'm going to be talking about today, and seeing if we can understand how lake ecosystems have responded to watershed disturbances in that time, and what does that mean for the amount of phosphorus that is accumulated in these systems. So I used a combination of environmental data sets that are publicly available, meta-analysis of paleolimnological studies, and also lake sediment cores that I had collected back in Arkansas and also here. And then with a lot of statistical analysis, ranging from time series analysis, machine learning-based clustering, and change point deduction, I combined that with watershed and lake morphological information. So we use global data sets to identify what each watershed area looks like, what is the slope, what is the flow and nutrient input is for these lakes. And then using gridded data sets for land use, population, and fertilizer application from 1900 still till now. We try to create this whole data set to find out what's going on. So this is essentially a map showing where the lakes are in our study, and this is based on what we had available in the literature. So if you just at a glance, if you look, you can see like most of the lakes are located in the northern hemisphere, which is kind of a problem because which we'll talk about later as well. But overall, these lakes mostly were quite shallow. If you can see, lakes in Asia particularly were less than 5 meters in depth. Some of the lakes are deeper, but overall shallower systems in general. And we had 225 lakes in general. These are just the histograms distributions for, we looked at watershed to lake area, lake depth, percent crops. Maybe it's a bit hard to identify from there, but mostly lakes, as I mentioned, they were quite shallow. They were less than 5 meters depth. They were also less disturbed, saying that the crop percent crop was less than 50%, with many of them were quite pristine as well. So I used hierarchical analysis to look at trajectories of lake phosphorus inputs, and we found 5 main clusters, which are represented here from C1 to C5. And if you can see that some of the things that kind of prominently stuck out for me is lakes that are located in Ireland or in UK versus ones that are in China and parts in Africa, for instance. So there are clear, distinct patterns in how phosphorus in lake sediment has changed in these systems. So if you look at the trajectories, so here we see an axis of 1900 to 2020, and I'm seeing 5 plots or 5 trends, and these are actually median phosphorus sediment concentrations for each cluster. So each cluster could see each trend could have, like, say, 50 or 30 lakes and so on. There's also the error bar, which I'm not showing here because it was too much to talk about in the time we have. But what I want you to take away from this is like 2 key trends that we found is mostly this green line here. It represents the phosphorus concentration in sediment in developed countries. So mostly in North America, in Europe, and you can see like there is a very neat increase in phosphorus accumulation in lakes around 1960s. So there's an early onset of phosphorus loading in these systems, which are leading to a ramp up into 1970s. But after 1970s and 80s, you see a bust of sorts. And that is linked to the banning of phosphorus-laden detergents, implementation of wastewater treatment plants. In comparison, so this orange line here can represents what we're seeing in terms of sediment phosphorus concentrations in Asia, particularly in China. And you see that they have a relatively lower onset of phosphorus loading, and they're seeing a huge ramp up in amount of phosphorus accumulating in lakes since the late 2000s, and it's kind of growing as we speak. And we looked at many different factors that can be driving these. So, but what we found most interesting was it was actually the amount of fertilizer that was added in these systems. So not just the concentration of fertilizer, but also the fertilizer that is kind of scaled by its watershed area, watershed or lake area. And you can see that the phosphorus fertilizer input for lakes in Europe and North America kind of follow a similar trend as you see in the lake sediment, whereas in Chinese countries, or sorry, Chinese lakes, or in other Asian lakes, we see a very distinct pattern and kind of explains what's going on in terms of sediment phosphorus. We also looked at other factors such as person crop, and you can see that the amount of area or the area under crop is much higher in the watersheds in China, for instance, compared to North America and Europe, which is interesting that they have a, it's a bigger country, bigger watersheds as well sometimes, and the overall person crops is much higher, but it's still the amount of phosphorus accumulation is not as high as you would see in these lakes. And this lower graph is essentially the amount of people living in each watersheds for these lakes that we have in our data set. And you can see, obviously, watersheds in China have much more people than you would see in Europe. So it kind of is, this was interesting because when you think about looking at lake sediments, or in general, we think about cropping patterns and person crop, but it always doesn't tell a story. It could, even though the amount of crops in this watershed was higher relatively, but when the fertilizer was added, how much was it added, and what the patterns in fertilizer addition was kind of was playing a bigger role in driving the phosphorus concentration in these lakes. And this is a principal component analysis, excuse me, assuming most of you have seen, but if you haven't, it's mostly, it's a multivariate regression method. These axes 1 and 2 are regression lines, and factors or vectors that you see along these lines kind of have the bigger explaining power. But what I want you to sort of focus here are groups of lakes. So if you see these lakes here, they mostly represent lakes that are in North America or in Europe, particularly. So these lakes also were quite shallow. They had higher fertilizer, cumulative fertilizer application, and they had the highest amount of phosphorus that was accumulated in the lake. In comparison, lakes in China, for instance, they have a recent increase in amount of fertilizer application, but the amount of phosphorus accumulated in these systems is relatively less. So it brings an interesting point, saying that when the onset of development happened, kind of drove the amount of phosphorus accumulation. So even though in European countries and in North America, for instance, the amount of fertilizer added has gone down significantly since the 70s, for instance, but we still see the historic or the legacy effect of the phosphorus input in the watershed, and which is still kind of fueling the accumulation of phosphorus in these systems. So if you look at this map, all the purple dots show really high phosphorus accumulations. There are lots of reds in North America as well. I mean, Lake Okeechobee, a no-brainer there. But what's interesting is that in China, for instance, even though the onset of modern agriculture, which includes addition of artificial fertilizer, is relatively newer, but we still see a higher amount of accumulation, and they're like the new hotspots, if you will, and they're catching up to the accumulation levels that we see in Europe, for instance. So, I'm sorry, this map looks strange. So we also looked at chlorophyll A concentrations. So not all of these lakes had chlorophyll A concentrations available, sediment chlorophyll A concentrations, but it's kind of not surprising that we saw an overall increasing trends in most of these lakes, which is, there's so many factors, not just phosphorus, but also, temperatures increasing and so on. So you see overall increase in productivity. But the rates in which we see increases are different. So some lakes, for instance, in Utah, they have much lower chlorophyll concentration. Rates of changes are different compared to, say, somewhere in China or in Lake Okeechobee here. And low nutrient concentration lakes may show a much stronger trend with how phosphorus sort of changes with that. So this is kind of ongoing work, and we're kind of finding more lakes. And this is also a place, if you're interested, if you have data that you want to contribute or you want to join in the process, so, more than welcome, more the merrier. We are currently in the process of working with this data set. So in general, what we're seeing in terms of conclusion is that the timing of onset of watershed disturbance matters a lot, and also morphology. I think I missed talking about that. So it's not just, yes, if you have a watershed where you see a lot of agricultural activities and a lot of fertilizer application, you would see more accumulation. But if you have a lake which is much smaller in size, doesn't get flushed as much, but has a much bigger watershed, so it has a higher watershed influence, you would see a much higher accumulation in phosphorus. Agricultural intensification, despite it being delayed in developing countries, is making the lakes the new hotspots for eutrophication and water quality issues. And clearly, paleolimnological data sets, we kind of know that they are effective. They can be useful and effective, helping shape water resource management strategies. People have been using these systems in places like Minnesota for a long time, and other places as well. But we can maybe use these to kind of get a global sense of what's happening. And they can help in filling gaps in global phosphorus budget and lake productivity models as well. So in terms of future work, we're trying to extend this work to all the lakes globally, and I'm going to introduce just a few slides to see what I'm doing. And if that's of interest, if you want to talk to me about that, contribute some way, please feel free to do that. So we're using a combination of machine learning tools and also like Monte Carlo simulation, other bootstrapping methodologies to understand what could are the ways we can estimate phosphorus accumulation lakes. So for instance, we're looking at a hydroshed database or hydrobasin database where we can get lake and watershed characteristics, so lake depth, and you can get information about watershed area, lake area, and I think slope as well. and lake residence time. So we're using all these information, watershed, and so morphological characteristics per se. And also we have developed this data set where we are looking at watershed phosphorus input for all the hydrobasins. It's a bit hard to see. So in this figure, I should have blown it up. But basically, we're looking at from the 1800s till now, how much phosphorus is available in these watersheds. So we're looking at atmospheric deposition, of course, inorganic fertilizer usage, manure. I mean, we're doing this for nitrogen, phosphorus, but focusing on phosphorus. So how many cattle heads are there? How much manure there is? So it's like a big mammoth undertaking that has been going on for some time, and involves many, many, many amazing undergrads and grad students and researchers working on this. So just to give a snippet of what it kind of looks like. So this is 1970s. And this is kilograms per hectare of phosphorus input. And you can see that in 1970s, as you would kind of expect in Europe, you see a much higher amount of phosphorus input, whereas places like China and India, they had relatively lower phosphorus input in the watershed. But in 2017, you can see that there clearly amount of phosphorus, as we had seen in the previous slides, the amount of phosphorus input in the watershed has kind of skyrocketed. And it's the amount of phosphorus available that can be mobilized to the lakes has gone down in lakes in Europe. And similar story you see in North America as well. So then I combined this with lake phosphorus accumulation trajectories that we had. We also used Monte Carlo simulations to then use the Hydro Lakes database, which has about 1 million lakes in its database. So through lots of math magic, we were able to do global lake phosphorus accumulation from this is from 1960s to, and I'm sorry, the label has kind of gone somewhere, but essentially it's showing phosphorus accumulation in lakes across the globe from 1960s till now. And you see a lot of gaps is because there's just not data that is not available. But even though we don't have a scale or a legend here, but you can kind of expect that, you know, in Midwest and in the Mississippi Valley, for instance, there's a lot of ag and there's a lot of phosphorus accumulation, same for Europe. But as I said, Asia is not far behind. So this is kind of where I'm gonna stop. So there are ways to use paleolimnological data to scale up and look at the globe in general. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. This is still starting. And if you have interest and want to collaborate in some way, please reach me. I think I shared my Twitter handle or X handle. So if you have any questions or any comments, or I would open up the thing for a discussion. And I also want to thank Nandita Basu and Kim Van Meter, who have been pivotal in doing the studies, this work, and the army of wondergrads, as I call them, especially Simon and Tawana, who've been rock solid in digitizing the data set and working with the watershed input models, and many, many, many undergrads that have worked on it. So that's all from today from me. Thank you so much for patiently listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you, Ruchi. That was a wonderful talk. If anybody does have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand if you would like to ask your question. I have a bunch of questions, but I would like to just start with one very simple one that will lead to another. But so would you say that the Asian phosphorus accumulation rate is lower than you would expect? Are you surprised to see it that low, or would you expect to see it higher?
So it was lower, but it's increasing. I was surprised that they're as high as they are, because so, you know, places like India and China, they have had traditionally, you know, people have lived there for a very, very long time. They have been doing agriculture for a very long time, but the amount of artificial fertilizers was quite low. You would see a lot more manure usage or like vegetable waste and things like that. So as the population has increased, the demand for food has increased, and they're adding more and more. And unfortunately, there's still not a good amount of regulation in how much nutrients we need to add. So that understanding still is kind of lacking. We have gotten a bit better in US and other North American countries, for instance, or in Europe, but the amount that the plant can possibly uptake is much lower than what is added. So we are building the surplus more and you're seeing more accumulation. So even though they started using artificial fertilizer much later, the amount of phosphorus accumulated is much, much higher. So that was kind of surprising to me, that how fast they're catching up. So
yeah, I wondered if there were any major differences in crop types and the way that the agricultural system is connected to the watershed. You know, in a lot of the Midwest, we have tile drainage and we're trying to get the water off the landscape as quickly as possible, and it's transporting things and actually causing more of a phosphorus source sometimes from the stream getting eroded in this instance. And I just wondered if maybe the way the two agricultures have developed, or
yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of the Asian countries, they did not see glaciation that, like we said, saw in, Midwest, for instance, or so yes, tide drainage is a big issue, because you also have, like, when it rains, for instance, you see the residence time of water and nutrients moving through the watershed has gone really down, because you just flush everything out. So you have a lot of labile or reactive nutrients that's available. So you have which goes straight into the lake and sits there for algae and other microbes to sort of feed on. We don't see a lot of that in India and China, because also the places where agriculture is concentrated is, like, they're big floodplains. So you can think of them more similar to a Mississippi River basin than a Midwest, so to speak. So there's a lot of rice that is being grown in both the countries, and a lot of fertilizer that is being added to sort of, so it's kind of like they were all kind of big wetlands in a way, which, have now been turned into ag lands. So I think when I go there and think about that, I'm like, okay, this is like Mississippi to me, looks similar to. I can't speak for China, but for India, I am from there, so I can. It reminds me of just flat rice crop for us, as far as you can see.
Yeah, the Mississippi floodplain in places is 200 miles wide. I mean, it's
Yeah.
Sarah, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Ruchi, for a really interesting talk. And you were talking a lot about the morphology and the phosphorus inputs and accumulation. And I was just wondering, with that information, are you able to take it and say, what would be the places that would be most effective to reduce phosphorus inputs? Like, where are we going to get the most, lake cleanup for watershed work?
Yeah, I mean,
does that
that's, I'm cutting you off, but that's like $1 billion question. Like, the whole management aspect is that, like, finding or optimizing where we want to implement a BMP, for instance, or what places. So this project kind of is kind of leading up to that. The whole point is to find areas where we could, so what are the vulnerable areas, or what are the optimal areas where you would try to protect or implement some sort of intervention, so to speak. So yes, that's the goal, because so these kind of data sets, like, so as paleolimnologists or ecologists, we kind of think about, like, we're done here. Okay, we know lake is, becoming eutrophic. But you can use this kind of data sets to then validate watershed nutrient transfer models. So people are building nutrient transfer models that go from 1800s till now, but they don't have a way to really test them. So having paleolimnological data sets, we can actually do that, and that's something we are doing. So there are groups of people that I'm working with that are kind of using my data sets that I'm creating and working with them to do that. And as a result of that, you can actually then start to find out that, okay, in this watershed, where do we have a wetland area? Is it better to implement a BMP there, or should we convert an ag land into turn it into a wetland? Things like that. So bigger questions that can be implemented to really then help limit the. So yeah, your question is, like, yes, we can do that, but there's a lot of steps that needs to happen to get to that point. But if you can do that, that would be really fantastic. So
great. Thank you.
Ruchi, I'm just curious if in the phosphorus accumulations, were you able to look at phosphorus fractionation at all? And did you see different components of phosphorus being the key contributors?
So at this scale, it's kind of difficult. So a lot of the sediment phosphorus data is metadata analysis. So we did digitize them. So for lakes that had like other forms of phosphorus, we have that information, and also like organic carbon and stuff like that. But at this scale, it's hard to see. So you can do case studies where you can look at and see how maybe a more labile form has increased or decreased. And also like places, what's interesting is like we're seeing this, and I didn't talk about it here, like places in Europe, like which are not as ag dominated, like central United States, for instance. We see that they implemented a wastewater treatment plant, but the type of phosphorus that we're seeing that is being washed in or accumulated is very different. So it's like going from particulate to more, say, TP to SRP. Those ratios have kind of definitely changed. Also, like if you have reservoirs in the watershed. So there are many things that's going on. So this is just like a one pass filter, so to speak, of what's going on. Yes, Sarah. Sorry, I'm taking over your job, David.
No, me again. You showed a number of paleo chlorophyll records, and are those from pigment analyses?
They are from pigment analysis, yeah.
And how widespread are those? Is there a pretty good coverage of paleo chlorophyll across the country?
So I was looking at the lakes where I had phosphorus. No, it's a smaller data set, but I'm trying to build a chlorophyll data set. And there are efforts from, so you probably have heard of Gluon. So there is an effort in that group of scientists as well, trying to sort of generate this data set. So people are contributing sediment trajectory, chlorophyll trajectories that they have, and also digitizing from paper. So yeah, so if you are interested in that, I'll be happy to.
Yeah, I'll follow up with you.
Yeah, for sure. Because I mean, digitizing, and plus people work with meta-analysis, but when you're thinking about paleolimnology, there's just so many levels of like, okay, you have to think about with this lead 210 data, there's lead excess, there's just chronology becomes a big thing as well. So a lot of people approached me and they were like, well, we have chlorophyll. I'm like, yeah, but we need something that is a dated sediment core. So, but I'm sure you know people who have this kind of data set, or probably you have generated data sets yourself that can be of use. So yeah, it's a challenging thing to do, and I was thankful that this university, there was a system and number of people available who were willing to sort of work with that. But yeah, so we need people to kind of generate the data set. So yeah, if you're interested, please.
Yeah, I'll follow up with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kind of tying into what we were both just hitting on with our questions, I'm curious if there, other than through Gleon, if there's any sort of way or effort to standardize paleolimnology data so it can all be used in this way. And I know you can focus on the diatoms, and you think about how the data is generated, what taxonomic references we're using. There's so many variables going into creating that data, and I know the different other abiotic analytes have varying, for pigment data, there's different ways to generate.
So your question is there a way to standardize? I wish there was. And I feel like, so this is I feel like when I was trying to digitize and teaching the students, we're like, here, this is what a plot looks like. And the older papers there's no standard format. But I think since, Steve Juggins and they have come in the picture and they have published data sets or our packages, it's become slightly more standardized in how we present our plots. And that has helped a little bit. It's just not all over the place. But in terms of like a big data harmonization effort, it doesn't exist. Like it's me, right? But if there's, but yeah, if there's interest in it, would be great, because I feel this is such a cool data set. And the reason why people don't do it is just, it's a lot of work. But once you have that, there's just limits. You're just limited by your own imagination of what you can go and do with that. And I talk with here I work in the global water future world, which is a collaboration of many universities across Canada and also globally. And it's just like we as paleontologists think differently. Like how we think of how a data can be used is very different from what somebody who does like a watershed modeling and their application. So if the data sets, if you can generate these data sets and publish them as data papers even, they'll be very nicely used. So yeah.
I think data papers.
So we need more paleontologists to do this.
I think data papers are great, but then also just making sure that things end up in the supplementary files.
Yeah.
I think a lot of
there's definitely a push for that, and we're trying, but it is a lot of work, fortunately. But I'm trying.
Yeah. Well, I guess, again, just even advocating, like if you do a paleolimnology study, throw, your dating data in there, or raw data. And I think that's true for a lot of fields that are trying to pool resources together.
I think there's a shift in how we share data. Like earlier, even in early 2000s, nobody talked about sharing data, but now a lot of people put their data in repositories, which I'm so thankful for. But still there should be EDI and all that is great, but still there's not a standard format of like how you provide data. I feel maybe I don't know if Sarah has more experience with that. I feel like NOAA, I think they have like a paleofire and all this kind of data sets, or paleolimnological or data sets. I think they have a standardized format relatively of how you can upload the data, but I'm not sure. But EDI is like nobody has checked the data, is just there. That is also an issue. So we're finding we get the data, but it's often like reaching out to the authors. We're like, hey, this looks odd. Sometimes they respond, sometimes they don't. So
I see Don Charles online. Don, can you speak to what in Neotoma, like, is there chlorophyll? Do you archive, or does that include chlorophyll records?
It does not include very many chlorophyll records. There are a number of sediment chemistry records, but it's not there's not a lot of them, and it's primarily because there hasn't been a person or a group that's really specialized in those. But there's a place there, and there also needs to be, as has been discussed, I think a better format for the data. It's for like a lot of the data that goes in Neotoma, it's in different formats, and it needs to be put in some kind of a standard format, and there needs to be agreement amongst contributors about what that would be. But it's certainly been done for several types of data, and there's no reason why it can't be done for phosphorus and chlorophyll. I put phosphorus data sets into Neotoma. And I think something like phosphorus and nitrogen, those are fairly straightforward to put in. I would encourage people to add them, and anybody wants any help trying to find out what is in Neotoma, I can help.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. And anything else with Neotoma?
Thanks, Don. Anybody else? Questions or comments? Feel free to raise your hand or just speak up, or put something in the chat if you'd rather not speak. It's a great opportunity. We have Ruchi here.
I know there's not a diatom that were talked about in this paper, but in this presentation, but or you just want to collaborate. I am starting a new position, so I need collaborators. Always interested.
As you put together, you know, this is like a global paleolimnological meta-analysis, which is super impressive. Do you find there's still the need to do meta-analyses within like certain climate regions, or there's geographic just patterns to lakes and their ecologies, and even looking across the state of Minnesota, there's kind of 3 distinct lake regions, and I'm wondering, as you're still putting together the big pie, are you still also maybe trying to look at each of the slices as well?
So at this moment, not. I mean, like if you're working in Minnesota, you know the ecoregional differences more. For me to, and I'm sure if I talk to somebody who's working in lakes in Sweden, they'll be like, oh, absolutely, there has to be a gradient, right? So it's kind of hard to do that at the level that I am looking at. But yes, there's definitely possibilities to dig more into it and be like, okay, if you're just comparing a Wisconsin versus Minnesota, for instance, or things like that. So there's scope to look into more regionally, like hone down and dig deeper into it. But like first it needs to be all together, and this is just also the papers that I found, and some of them, if they had lead chronology as well, or lead to tin or cesium as well. So there are lots of checks and balances that can be had to do, but yeah, there's definitely scope to dig deeper. And it's an interesting point, that's why we need more people. Like I work with the 3,000 lakes that I have, or 10,000 lakes that I have in Minnesota, and I can make case studies from that and compare to someone that could be paper, many papers that can come out of it. But yeah, me alone is like too much, but sure.
Tom Frankovich has a quick question. And he's curious if there is or Tom, do you want to ask it?
Sure. Yeah, Rishi, great presentation. It was nice seeing the whole global picture, and it really paints out what's going on greatly. And it was nice to see that some developed countries have decreased their inputs, and you sort of have this bell-shaped curve, and developing countries are still on that big, huge rise. And we seem to have some, control over what the inputs are, but I question, we don't seem to have much control over these legacy inputs. So my question was, can these things in these lakes be buried, and at what depth is it required? And we can possibly extrapolate that out, use the sedimentation rate. Say, hey, maybe in 15 years we can start to see some, less input from legacy, sources. So, yeah.
Yes. So the short answer is yes. Of course, as I think that if you just depth-wise, if you look at the top 10, 15 centimeter, that's like the most available, gets used up, recycled, resuspended, so on. As you go down in the sediment core, it does get buried. And you have to look at profiles for each individual lake to sort of, that depth sort of changes for each lake, as you would imagine. So it's not like a same cutoff, but so yeah, in terms of trying to figure out when, if you have, that's a question we are also trying to address. Like there's a big model which we call Element that was developed with Nandita and Kim, where we're trying to see how much, from the watershed perspective, they have kind of trying to figure out what is the labile pool, so to speak, that can be mobilized and can keep on feeding into the receiving water, which could be Gulf of Mexico or the Chesapeake Bay or whatnot. The same way, adding the lake, the mobile layer, so to speak, and then seeing how long it takes. So but that's a lot of modeling effort that needs to be done. But sure, at some point it will be buried, and at some it is buried. But the top, I mean, it's quite safe to say the top 15 centimeters just goes very quickly and recycles through the water column. And
all right, so you say 50 centimeters. So if you have a sedimentation rate, average about a centimeter per year, you're talking about 50-year recovery if you stopped, reduced your inputs. Yeah, it's still quite a ways away. but good to
Yeah.
know. Thank you.
So there's a paper, I forget which year. It's a paper by Kaylin Carey. She's a professor at Virginia Tech, or University of Virginia. Sorry, and Ryden. So Carey and Ryden. So they looked at sediment profiles. They don't have chronology data with that. It's just with depth, and they kind of looked at what depth you see where it starts getting buried. So that's a paper. I can send it to you if you're interested in looking at that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So Anna says that when we have a big storm and all that buried phosphorus is back in the water column, yes, of course. Systems that are shallow and are sloshing around, or they have like a bioturbation issue. Yeah, and also like recent, as of now, like we are seeing changes in mixing patterns and how long things stay stratified and mixed. It's all shifting. So that's a big issue. We don't know at an individual lake level. Like forget about global scale. We don't know for many lakes like what's happening now. We're seeing more internal loading, but yeah, it's a dynamic system that. Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
No, thank you, Ruchi. I do want to, before anybody else leaves, I want to put out one other announcement. Sarah has talked about the next Diatom Web Academy coming up. John Smol will be talking with us, someone else who's done some paleolimnology in his day. And then the other thing, just to put on everybody's radar, it's really soon, but the first Young Diatomist Silica session is tomorrow, and that's at 2 p.m. UK time, and that means it's 9 a.m. for those on the East Coast of the US. So Sarah, if you're ready at 7 o'clock for some diatom information, I think it'll be there for you. But yeah, just before anybody else leaves, I wanted to throw that on everybody's radar. So Ruchi, is your just maybe one last quick question about your future at Cleveland. Is your plan to focus on continuing to assemble paleolimnological data like this and study global trends?
Yeah, so I'm hoping to also take more course myself.
Yeah.
So there are lakes and also reservoirs. So one thing we saw in the data set is, well, we don't have much information about what's happening in the global south. So it's been kind of my effort. I'm trying to connect to researchers in India, Nepal, Africa as well, who are, kind of trying to do this kind of work and bringing them in the fold. And also we see a lot of the studies that we do, somehow they're not that agriculturally dominant system. So places that actually we need to think about where the phosphorus is, we don't have information for it. So we have to go and look into these systems. Also reservoirs, it's very underexplored. So
yeah. I think
so
it's
taking more course for sure. Yeah, and doing more of this.
I think as paleolimnologists, we're a little scared to go work in the places where the sediment is misbehaving, shall we say?
Yeah, I mean, I have first experience with that in Arkansas. So yeah, I am wary of that, but we'll see.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. And we will see everybody in 2 weeks. And yeah, thanks a lot, Ruchi.
Thank you.